Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the CBI at 10. I don't know about you, Matthew, but it feels a little bit like after the excitements of playing Wembley with the CBI annual conference this week, this is more like sort of singing songs around the campfire this morning. So it feels a little more back to life as usual. We've got so much, though, to cover because the annual conference ran Monday to Wednesday. Then on Thursday, the Chancellor came out with the extensions to furlough and with a whole set of further details on the economic package. And so what I hope that we'll be able to do for CBI members this morning is really get stuck into the detail of that. Everyone who's joining us, I'm imagining, knows the way CBI at 10 works. We want to hear from you. What are the concerns on your minds? What are the questions you've got? I'm delighted that we're not just joined by Matthew Fell, the CBI Policy Director, but Annie Gascoigne from the CBI too, who's stuck deeply into what the CBI does on the economy and is going to, I hope, give us the small print on Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor's announcement. And we're really grateful to James Jameson, Councillor Jameson, who's the chair of the Local Government Association. Possibly one of the most interesting subjects that's arisen in our country in the course of 2020 is about the way we're governed. And I'm hoping that James will be able to give us some detail both on the local restriction support grants, i.e. how money is available locally, but how decision making is made. But Matthew, would you start us off, if you like, and just give us your read on, I suppose let's start with the job retention scheme and the guidance that is going to business.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, James, and good morning, everyone. James, I think you're absolutely right. There's a saying that sort of a week is a long time in politics, and gosh, it certainly felt like that last week. You know, only just over a week ago since we had the Prime Minister telling us that we're heading back into sort of lockdown 2.0, that economic update from the Chancellor that you mentioned, and that's before we even get to Brexit and Biden, I guess, with everybody being glued to their screens and the US election results. So an awful lot happening over the past 7 days. I think really back in the COVID lane, as you say, confirmation that the furlough scheme has been reinstated, and interestingly that is now through until March. So I think one of the asks we'd had is put all of this in a longer term time horizon so that businesses can plan. So we got the time scale there from furlough on the back of CBI asks and others, and also the level and how it's going to operate back essentially to how we were at 80% contribution, with employers just putting in NICs and the pension contributions. So Annie will expand an awful lot more on that, but a major sort of pillar, if you like, in place insofar as business support with the furlough scheme. I think just as interestingly for business then, picking through the detail of who can be open and who can be closed. Worthwhile remembering the backdrop across the UK, of course. Northern Ireland had its lockdown, and that starts to ease at the back end of this week on the 13th. Wales, their fire break ends today, with non-essential businesses being able to reopen again. But for the rest of England, there's new guidance in play through until the 2nd of December. The Prime Minister was clear it lasts until then. I think, James, we're back living with this definition of people who can effectively work from home should do so. So a reminder to people that there is some flex in terms of that, particularly for office-based staff and so on. If they have really challenging conditions at home, then that flexibility does exist. We've then got businesses who are quite clearly closed again, non-essential retail, hospitality, accommodation and leisure and so on, but also details and clarity on those that can remain open. So obviously essential retail, supermarkets, hardware, garden centres, and also banks, petrol stations, dry cleaners and such like. Interestingly, when we look at this though, it's important to remember that only about 10% of the economy is definitively closed. The rest, so 90% open, albeit with a very challenging backdrop of suppressed demand and so on. But I think, James, that's important when we keep a perspective on these things, to remember that for many people and many businesses, they are still open and trying to live through this in a sense. So those were the major bits from last week.
Can I just ask a couple of things about the furlough? Because I know there are loads to get through this morning, but just on the furlough, there are two things that I've heard a lot of over the weekend. One is, I think lots of businesses kind of appreciate the CBI position, which is let's give ourselves, a longer timetable so we can plan. There is also a whiff of be careful what you wish for when the Chancellor comes out and says it runs till March. I think you've heard quite a lot of businesses and quite a lot of employees saying, does that mean that some version of lockdown is running through till March? The Prime Minister saying it's definitely ending on December the 2nd, but the furlough scheme runs through till March. Have you had any guidance from Treasury or Downing Street to explain what's going on there?
Well, I think, James, it is a key question. I think, in a sense, that is the next bit of the jigsaw to fill in, is the exit strategy and what do we launch into after the 2nd of January. I think
2nd of December.
2nd of December.
Yeah.
So I think most are assuming we go back into a tiered system of some form, and local lockdowns will have a role to play. I think the sooner that we can get clarity from a business perspective of what the measures are that will determine that. So, for example, is it going to be the absolute level of infection rates? Is it the rate of which that rate is increasing or decreasing? What is the combination of key measures and so on that I should be keeping an eye on a business and will be used to determine that? And if I'm able to track that, at least as a business, I'd be able to then start preparing for what happens in December when we emerge from the national lockdown. I think if we can get clarity on that sooner rather than later, that's a key bit of the conversations that we're going to be having this week.
Okay, I'm going to come to Annie in a second, but just before I do, Matthew, one other thing. Test and trace. There were some reports in the papers over the weekend about rollout beyond cities like Liverpool. And I know we talked last week, didn't we, at the conference about businesses being interested in getting engaged in mass test and trace. Is there any movement on that?
Yeah, absolutely, James. As you know, and we spoke about this at our annual conference last week, I think businesses do see this as a big part of being able to reopen safely and get the economy back to normal. We have been in conversations with the team there last week within the testing team within government. I think they're thinking about sectors and businesses that they can prioritise for getting early mass testing in place with, things like food, energy and logistics. But they're engaged in conversation with us because they're after real advice and pointers about where should they prioritise. And some thoughts from me on that. I said I'd focus on enabling industries, such as those that I've just jumped off, so that it matters not just for those businesses in their own right, but also right across the economy if everyone benefits from them being open and resilient. I think there's also businesses where we know productivity has been particularly challenged, where, for example, you've got social distancing requirements in place and people can't work close together in teams as effectively. And of course, there are those businesses that are currently closed and potentially could open up more with testing in place, both for their employees, but particularly for their customers as well. So we're working through with that right now. We've got a CBI roundtable later this week. So if people want details on that, let me know. And in particular, thoughts about how do we prioritise which businesses gain access to mass testing, and also how do they incentivise not just the businesses, but also the individuals to take part as well. Those are some of the questions that are on the minds of the testing team at the moment that we're helping them work through.
And Matthew, much as I love the idea of flooding your inbox first thing on a Monday morning, if you're a business that wants to stick your hand up and say, look, we'd be really interested in participating in mass testing, how do you route that through the CBI?
Absolutely. I mean, either get in touch with your account managers or just drop an email into the coronavirus mailbox, and we will make sure that is scooped up and follow that up with people.
Okay, that's brilliant, Matthew. I'm going to come back, so I'm sure there's going to be more to discuss as I bring James in a moment. But Annie, I've billed you as doing something that's almost impossible to do, which is to read between the lines of what the Chancellor announced on Thursday. Matthew's teed up the elements of this around JRS, but there are also some indications of changes on loans as well. I know that we're going to have a full session on Wednesday that looks particularly at lending and access to finance. You know, the CBI 10 will focus on that. But Annie, what's your read on what the Chancellor said on Thursday?
Yeah, so I mean, I appreciate that things are moving very fast, and again, the kind of Chancellor came out with new announcements. So to give you the headlines, obviously the extension of the job retention scheme to the end of March was the big one. There was also an increase in the self-employed income support scheme from 55% to 80% to match the job retention scheme in terms of generosity. And as you say, there was also an extension of existing loan schemes, the application window until the end of January. That's all the loan schemes, that's bounce back loans, coronavirus business interruption loans, the future fund, and the large CBILs as well, but also individuals, or sorry, companies that have taken out bounce back loans. Maybe they've taken out less than the maximum amount because perhaps they thought they wouldn't need the full amount, that this crisis wasn't going to last as long as it has done. They are now able to top up to the maximum amount. So essentially take out a top up to the loans they would have taken already. And then, of course, there's also the funding to local authorities. So we had news about kind of the funding that was going to be available in Tier 2 and Tier 3. Obviously, that's been somewhat superseded by the fact that in England, there are now national measures in place instead of the tiering system. But for every business that is closed during this month, they will be forced to close by government. There is up to £3,000 grant available, and then local authorities have also been given some discretionary funding to capture businesses that maybe aren't forced to close. So think about your kind of laundromat that might be in the supply chain of a large hotel, or your kind of food wholesaler, but also think about your businesses that don't have a physical premises, maybe your kind of flower delivery service that operates from somebody's home or garage. Those firms may now be able to access loans through local authorities, and maybe James will be able to give a bit more detail about how local authorities are distributing those. But it's a bit of a shift from where we were in the first lockdown, for sure, in that everything was done very centrally, and there were very clear rules about who local authorities could give those grants to. And now there's a bit more flexibility in the use of those funds for local authorities to have the discretion based on where they think the needs are in the business community. So it's actually quite a wide package.
Yeah, no, there's a lot, and actually, strangely, there's a much more to it than perhaps the original sort of Thursday reporting suggested. I'm going to come to James on particularly those issues around local allocation of funds. But Annie, when we did some of these webinars back in April and May, one of the issues that kept coming up was about the small print of access to the JRS, and particularly around things like holidays. And I'm now aware that you've got furlough extending over Christmas. And are you beginning to get any guidance at all, or two things really, where the terms under which companies can access the furlough scheme for employees who've not previously been furloughed or who've been brought back into the workforce, and two, whether there are any special rules around furloughing over the Christmas holiday period?
Yeah, sure. So in essence, to put sort of businesses' minds at ease, the scheme is very, very similar to what we saw operating in August. It is 80% of regular pay, but employers are required to pay national insurance and auto-enrollment pension contributions, which on average accounts for around 5% of the cost of employing somebody. It's about £70 per month for an average employee. So there is some business contribution under this version of the JRS, unlike, say, back in July, but that's the exact same level that we saw in August. In terms of who can access the scheme, it's open again to everyone. So where we've previously seen the scheme closed to new entrants and caps put on business as usual, introduce, that has now been removed. So whether you're a business that's never used the CJRS before or an employee that's never been furloughed before, you can now be, you are now able to access the scheme, or your employer can access it on your behalf. The scheme opens from November in 2 days' time, so from the 11th of November, and firms can access and apply for November payments until the 14th of December. So there is a reasonably long period, but all the calculations in terms of eligibility, reference pay, the calculation of holiday are all exactly the same as they were in August. There are a couple of things that I would flag as being slightly different. The first is that from December, firms that access the scheme from December onwards will be, the names of those firms will be published. That is new. That is to help employees to combat fraud. So that's something that on reflection, the Treasury have decided to introduce. And then the second thing I would say is that even though the scheme officially runs until the end of March, what the Chancellor has said is that in January he will reassess the scheme based on the economic conditions, and what we may actually see, as we saw from August, as we started to come out of the first lockdown, we may start to see the tapering reintroduced, where there is an increase in employer contribution and a reduction in the government contribution. But that's all caveated by the fact that we just don't know what the economic situation is going to be like in January. The Chancellor doesn't want to nail his colours to the flag right now. He wants to see where we are. And clearly, although this lockdown should end at the start of December, as we've known with coronavirus throughout, it's very uncertain and what could happen. But I think what's important, as Matthew said, is actually there is some certainty that there will be a scheme. And what we saw over August and September is actually, yes, firms get to reopen, but it takes time for demand to recover, for people to feel comfortable and confident to go back to shops, restaurants. And that's what having this certainty over the scheme in place to March allows for. It allows for that demand to come back.
Okay, Annie, thank you. That's massively helpful. I'm going to come back on some of the points you made about local, but Councillor Jameson, it's brilliant of you to join us this morning. There are a slew of questions, as Matthew and Annie were talking, about the discretionary grants that local authorities can now make. So there's some very specific ones, but can you just spell out, if you would, for us, James, how these local restriction support grants and these additional grants are going to work?
So, well, as Annie was just explaining, you have the ones that are pretty much prescribed, which is up to £3,000 a month for those with rateable values, up to £51,000 and lower levels at lower rateable values, and that's just prescribed, and look up the rules, and that's what it will be. The discretionary ones are quite different. It is, in theory, a lot of local flexibility. So as Annie was implying, some of the businesses who won't be in shut will potentially be eligible for that. But also the money we've been given is from now until March. So what isn't clear is what else is it supposed to cover. So for instance, there will be businesses that will get a grant because they're shut down, but obviously they won't be up full and running on the 2nd of December. So, we also need to look at, do they need to come out of this grant as well? So I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to give you some definitive answers, because we're just seeking clarity as to what will happen with those businesses. And as Matthew was implying earlier, we come out of this on the 2nd of December, but in some parts of the country we will still be in tier 3, and other parts will be in tier 2, and other parts in tier 1. So there will be a number of businesses that will still face restrictions, and the original funding, which was based on £20 per head of population, which was given to the likes of Manchester, etc., was actually to support those businesses in in tier 3. So we will be finding local solutions to it, but we still ourselves need some guidance as to what is expected to be covered with this. And I hope that in the next sort of 7 days or so, we'll have that clarity.
And James, a lot of the questions are exactly the point you're making, really. It's the sort of judgment of Solomon question. who's in and who out and how do local authorities decide. Just to give you a flavour of some of those questions that come in. So one person has written to ask, how much chance is there for supply chain companies to access funding via the local authority discretionary grants, asking on behalf of hospitality supply chain, which is shut if the hospitality is shut? And there's another question, right? And now we're really in the weeds, so forgive me. This is on the additional restrictions grant, right? There's point 23. We encourage local authorities to develop discretionary grant schemes to help those businesses which, while not legally forced to close, are nonetheless severely impacted by the restrictions put in place to spread the control of COVID-19. And I suppose it's that interpretation, is it severely impacted, or, you know, linked to businesses are shut but themselves not shut. How are local authorities expected to make a judgment on that?
So not an easy one. I think the first thing local authorities need clarity on is, when is this money expected to be spent? Because it's very clearly different if it is just covering up until, say, Christmas, or if it's having to cover up until March, and actually also has to cover people who may be eligible for the £3,000 this month, but not next month. So when we get that clarity, we'll have a better idea of the pot. But it very clearly is there to support businesses that you just described, those who are technically not eligible for grants. So, for instance, businesses who use shared office space, and that's what a lot of the discretionary grant was last time, who don't pay direct rates and hence are not eligible. And also those, and you're right, those who are in the distribution supply chain to hotels and restaurants, clearly their business is going to be very impacted. So those are the sorts of businesses that I would expect to be applying for this grant. The quantum, I think, is the question.
Mm-hmm. And James, what do you do about, or what are you hearing local governments are doing? There's a question here which I think is a really good one, also difficult. What are local authorities doing to provide support for businesses in their regions that are not on the high street, i.e. not hospitality or retail, i.e. some of those businesses that are really having a really hard time, but not visibly so?
So, I mean, I think all councils will be trying to support the businesses. So this scheme, and you rightly point out, many of the support businesses for hospitality aren't on the high street. You know, your laundry that is supplying, or rather cleaning sheets and whatever for a hotel is going to be devastated potentially by this. And that'll be round the back in some corner. There will be other supply chain businesses. So they will be the sorts of businesses that we're looking to support with this. But generally, most councils will also be out there talking to their businesses and asking what else they can do to support people. As ever, you know, money will be part of it, but actually in many instances there is other things like licensing, supporting, marketing, helping businesses relocate, putting them in contact with other opportunities. So all councils do have a business development arm that are going out there at the moment trying to join the dots.
And James, can we I'm making a pretense, I suppose you can hear, to understand the weeds of, you know, Article 23. Can we step back, if you like, and zoom back to the overall picture for local government and what you think's happened in the settlement between local government and Westminster and Whitehall, and what you think, this thing is going to be with us for a while, what you think needs to change when you look ahead?
Well, COVID has been a terrible disaster for this country and many people, but what I think it has demonstrated is that local government is much faster and much more responsive. And if you want to get stuff done on the ground, local government does that. And, you know, whether that has been things like, you know, when we did distribute the grants the first time round, rates relief, you know, getting old people, vulnerable people into care homes, helping them in care homes, helping our vulnerable children, continuing with all our daily services, whether that's emptying or bin, licensing, planning system. That's all gone on and worked pretty effectively. And I think there's a recognition that's because it's local and it's done by people who know their area. And certainly I am seeing more support, both nationally and with government, that if you want to get things done, do it locally. And I and the LGA are huge proponents of devolution. At the end of the day, if we look at this country, it is about a business, it's about a person, it's about a community. And with the best will in the world, if I'm looking at a small business in Newcastle, or a family in Newcastle, or a small housing estate in Newcastle, someone in Whitehall doesn't have the faintest idea of what's going on, but the people in Newcastle do.
Yes.
And therefore, the local council should be doing that and should be pulling all the things together on a local basis. And whether that's in Newcastle or Truro, or in my case in Bedfordshire, or in Matthew's case in I think Chesham, sorry, Princess Risborough, local people and local communities and local councils can pull together across the business sector, the public sector, to deliver. And I think that's increasingly important.
Sorry for interrupting, but isn't there an irony to this? Because on the one hand, the sort of public engagement with the idea of devolution is much greater probably than any time I can remember. But the white paper on devolution that seemed to promise some real changes feels like it's got kicked into next year. Am I right in that? And therefore, the likelihood of any concrete progress is actually delayed.
I love government terminology about timescales. So I believe it has gone from imminent to soon. So that means probably after Christmas. I have some sympathy in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic. It is quite hard to get difficult discussions and decisions through government. And their priority must be on this crisis, and we also have Brexit looming. So I have some sympathy that the bandwidth is not there, but I think fundamentally it is crucial to the success of this country that we have genuine devolution to a local level, and we empower people to do things at the local level. And if you look at how much the public sector does, being able to have at the local level the coordination between BEIS, DWP, the NHS, interestingly the MOD, because they own lots of land in different places, and local councils, pulling all that together can make a huge difference to businesses, to the community, and the planning system, and Department of Transport. There is a really big prize there, but it's a difficult prize to get, because you're going to have to bang a lot of heads together and effectively take power away from the centre.
I think, by the way, James, I have to say, I'm going to definitely use within our own family this new distinction between imminent and soon. Like, I'm going to do the washing up soon means after Christmas, and imminent means probably today, which is a very, very, very handy distinction. Can I want to go back to Matthew and Annie in a moment, just because there have been a slew of questions about some of the details on JRS. But James, can I just pick up on the thing that Matthew touched on at the top, which was about mass testing? And we heard a lot from Andy Burnham last week, as we have in the summer, about the use of local government to actually make sure that not just the testing is happening, but the tracing and isolate is really happening. And I wondered, as you begin to think forward to the rollout of mass testing, what you think local government should do with central government to make it work.
So there are several things there. There is tracing, which is effectively the whole business around, someone is infected, talk to them, find out who they've been in contact with, then trace their contacts. So that's a kind of logistics, people contacting thing, and then persuade them to isolate. And I really emphasize this. We do need to talk about persuading, because I think one of the things we've learned in this pandemic is people are not isolating. I don't have the verifiable statistics, but I see lots of anecdotal evidence that only around 20% of people are fully isolating for 14 days. I'm sure the vast majority are isolating to an extent, but that is a big issue. So the test and tracing system will only work if people isolate. Mass testing is something slightly different, because you're actually going either to a city or to a venue or a setting and testing everybody. So while they overlap, they are different. Now, I think getting test and tracing right, and I think the role of local authorities there is really important, because if you are a local person phoning up somebody and you saying, you know, dear Mr. Harding, you've been tested positive, you know, where have you been in the last week? Actually, a local person will know where that is. So in my case, you know, I know where the White Hart is. So if someone says it been to the White Hart, I know that's in Ampthill, and I get a feel for the place, and I'm talking
Yes.
to a local. If somebody from, you know, 200 miles away phones up, you don't have that local knowledge, that local engagement. So really important for local. The mass testing.
Can I just, James, forgive me. So I think we've really clocked that, and we've also understood that in certain places there are certain communities, there are certain people in certain kinds of jobs who may be more wary than others of actually giving up their jobs, you know, for
Yes.
reasons of interest. I tell you what I don't know is whether or not this problem has really been digested by government and that a different way of working together is in the works.
So I think there is now recognition that if we're going to long term have a successful test and tracing, and let's not kid ourselves, this 4-week lockdown will not cure it. The vaccine will not cure it overnight. We're going to be living with this. Now, whether that's for 12 months or 24 months, I couldn't tell you. But having a vaccine, having a test and tracing regime and a mass testing regime that works will be critical. And I think this 4-week lockdown is an opportunity to really bump up the local tracing. And as you're alluding to earlier, the mass testing, and the mass testing is all about settings. I would just have one note of caution. We need to think about mass testing in terms of, is this used as a gatekeeper? Like, you know, you haven't got COVID, you're allowed into this venue. That's useful, but far more useful is if you also extract the data. But that will be a lot harder for businesses because, you know, okay, you're okay, you've got a negative test, inputting that into a computer system and inputting the positive cases into the computer system so these can all be followed up is a much more complex task, but a really, really important task, because the only way we're going to get on top of this is it's not just about keeping the venue open, it is taking all those asymptomatic cases and making sure that they isolate. And then we need to think about, you know, the behavioral science as to how do we get people to isolate, and is 14 days too much?
Matthew, can I just come back to you, James? Thank you very much. Can I just come back to you, because I suppose what we're hearing actually between Annie and James is like quite a meaty to-do list for December the 2nd, i.e. what the sort of exit plan is. And I wonder whether you've got a kind of piece of paper somewhere that you're trying to put together what the ask is of business on government for coming out of this.
Well, thanks, James. I scribbled a to-do list, if you like, almost, and sadly it's all imminent rather than soon, I think. But in terms of urgency, I mean, if you just sort of work through it in a sense, it still feels to me there are parts required to iron out on what further support is required. We know there are particular sectors that are really badly hit by this and have been all the way through. I'm thinking particularly of the likes of aviation and so on there. So it does feel to me like there is a bit more work to do on the support piece. Then I think in the way that we've been able to achieve this for the furlough scheme, putting the rest of the business support piece in a longer term framework is really important, so that business is not coming back on a sort of hand-to-mouth existence, asking for more on occasion as the facts change. But can we really see, when is that going to be in place for a period of time, so I can plan around that with a degree of certainty over the medium term. Next up, I would have this clarity about the exit strategy that I talked about, so that companies are clear what they're emerging into, and if we can have the details on how that is going to be worked out and so on rapidly, as opposed to 5 to midnight on the 1st of December, for example. Again, people won't be scrambling around for that. And then I've got 2 further bits on my list, James. The testing piece, and it's interesting what Councillor Jameson was just saying. I think the incentives around testing are really quite important, so we get those lined up, both for the individuals making sure that they are not so financially disadvantaged that they think, actually, what's in it for me, but also that then we really get the communications good to say, actually, doing the right thing is in the right interests of making sure I've got a job to go back to because the business is much more resilient and so on, and I'm doing the right thing for my colleagues and my co-workers as well as just for me personally. So there's quite a lot to do around the incentive side on testing, I think. And then the final bit on my list, James, is around the growth agenda. And this is phenomenally difficult. We're all trying to do really short term and also think about long term simultaneously. And I think there is increasingly a piece of work required to do around the growth agenda, which is on the retraining and job creation side of things. What are going to be the growth areas of the economy in the future? But we can all rattle off digital or green or health and social care. Beyond that, what do we actually mean? So in the green agenda, for example, we know we're going to need to do retrofit boilers. We know we're going to accelerate the rollout of EV charging. What are the particular skills and so on that companies need? So there's a big bit around the jobs and the retraining thing. And then the other part of it, which Annie is doing a lot of work on, is around the investment climate and incentives. So as soon as companies are able and in a position to do so, how can we then accelerate out of this into recovery? Those agenda items will feel quite a long way off for many businesses, but it's really important that we lay the groundwork on them so that when the recovery is able to get going, we can accelerate into it as much as we can.
Matthew, can I just ask you one thing about what you said about incentives for isolate, right? So I'm very confused about the maths of mass testing. So if you move into a world where many more people are tested, and particularly with a high instance of asymptomatic infection, my expectation is you would have more people being asked to isolate, and therefore you would have a much larger expectation on government for financial support, but also companies looking to backfill in certain cases the people missing from work. Are you beginning to see some real work on how that's going to be funded and how that's going to be supported?
I think we're starting to work that through, James, on the incentives piece. I think in my mind for businesses, of course, there will be the potential for more people to be away from work if they're identified and isolated. But the upsides that they're trading that off with are, one, can my people work more productively? So, for example, those settings and so on where proximity is a real issue because of social distancing. If I get people tested and they are negative, can we move to a situation where that removes some of that requirement? So there's a productivity win in it. And the other one is for those business settings that James Jameson outlined about businesses starting to reopen at all. For example, if you can get people in certain venues. So there is upside as well as people being off as well.
All right, Annie, can I come back to you? We're going to consider this the job retention scheme quickfire round, because as you can imagine, there are a number of people who've got questions. So firstly, can we just talk about the job retention scheme bonus, right? So what's happened to that? Is that now, lots of companies, I'll give you an example of a good question here, right? So one person has written to say, in regard to the job retention bonus, many businesses have budgeted for this in their projections, i.e. they're going to keep it and therefore get the money. They're going to keep the people and get the money. This is now not going to be paid in February. Decisions have been made on redundancies, keeping staff on with the knowledge of this bonus being paid. What are your thoughts on this? And is there any indication that the Chancellor will implement it at some later date?
Yeah, so I think that was clearly hidden in the detail of the announcements last week, that the job retention bonus was now not going to be paid in February. There's no clarification about when it would be paid thereafter, and the policy is under review. So I think if you were a betting person, you probably wouldn't bet on having that funding there in the medium term. And I think the economic rationale for that policy being temporarily removed is that it was there as an incentive to essentially top up wage costs over November to January for firms that had been using the job retention scheme up until that point. So it was meant as a kind of easing of the costs back into normal life. So it was a policy designed at a point in time when we thought by this time, at the point this year, we would be coming out of this crisis and back towards normality. That obviously hasn't happened, and so the Treasury are arguing that the economic rationale for the scheme has gone. I think we're definitely hearing those examples of firms who'd planned on that basis, but I would say the job retention scheme is there. It's much more generous than the job retention bonus.
But it is different, isn't it, Annie? Because there was a bonus for keeping people, and now there's payment for those people who aren't in the office. Can I ask a couple of other things? JSS, the job support scheme, is that now gone? What's the deal with the JSS?
So the JSS has been postponed, and so the JRS and the JSS will not run concurrently. So the JRS is in place until the end of March, and then there is a question about whether the JSS. So remember that the job support scheme was put in place initially for 6 months, starting from November. So that would run until the end of April.
But that is significant
normally,
because it means, Annie, that the financial supports for keeping people, if you like, part-time, or a number of people part-time, is not there. Am I right? That's the JSS is not there.
No, so the job retention scheme, if you recall, the government introduced partial furlough, so or otherwise known as flexible furlough. That is still available, and that is fully flexible. You can have somebody working 1 hour a week and be able to access the JRS.
Okay, that's very helpful. And then this is your bonus question: are furloughed staff still accruing holiday, and does it roll over into 2021?
My understanding is yes, they are. It's the same as in the guidance. I would definitely, the full guidance is going to get published at some point this week, presumably before the 11th of November, so either today or tomorrow. But my understanding is it's the same as it was in August. So yes, holiday is still accruing.
And then I'm going to come one final, Annie, thank you, that's massively helpful again. James, one final question, just given the interest in the discretionary grants from local authorities, what does the Local Government Association most want businesses to do in the way in which they contact and approach local government? Because I imagine that many of your colleagues are just swamped by people getting in touch.
So as per the last grant scheme, local government will be setting up basically an online form to access this grant, and they will publicise it locally. Each local council will do it differently, but in essence, if you want the grant, pretty much every council will be putting an online link on their web page. That obviously is not available yet because we haven't got all the details from government yet, but once we have that, that will be online. The rules will be online, and people should apply that way.
Okay, well, Councillor Jameson, thank you, and Annie Gascoigne too. Thank you very much. Great to see you here, Matthew. In the last just a minute or two, I mean, I'm a failure as a newsman. We've kind of skirted Brexit. We haven't touched on Joe Biden, as you said. Will you just give us a sense of the sort of CBI's week, because there is a massive coincidence of things facing business, and I imagine that means there's a lot on your desk too.
Yeah, well, James, in addition to everything that we've talked about today, I'm clearly working through then the ramifications of the US election result and what that means for British business and trade in particular. I think in particular there could be opportunities around the whole net zero agenda and so on that we can pursue more on a global scale. They feel like good things to get on the case with right away. And then, of course, on Brexit, making sure, as we've been saying for so long now, we get a deal over the line, and then assuming that is the case, and let's not take that for granted, but assuming we can do that, working out what are the bits that we need to build on from there to add in and build on that deal over time. Those are absolutely going to be top of the to-do list for this week.
Great. Matthew, Fel, thank you. It's great to see you. Matthew, Annie and James, thank you very much for your time this morning. Thank you everyone for joining us. As I said in passing, on Wednesday, CBI at 10, we're going to really look at the whole questions of coronavirus business interruption loans, the bounce back loans, and debt more generally, please do join us at 10. But between now and then, have a good day and a very good week. Many thanks.